James Comey blasted the Trump administration during testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
He told the committee he believes President Trump fired him to stop an investigation into Russia's ties to the Trump campaign. Comey refused to say whether he thinks the president broke the law, leaving that up to the special counsel to determine. Comey repeatedly said the president lied about him and about the FBI.
The administration then chose to defame me and, more importantly, the FBI by saying that the organization was in disarray, that it was poorly led, that the workforce had lost confidence in its leader. Those were lies, plain and simple. Congress created...
Comey reiterated his concerns about the president lying during another part of his testimony, saying that is why he started writing memos as soon as he left any meeting with President Trump. He also admitted he was the one who leaked the contents of that memo to the news media. President Trump reacting to the testimony early this morning after staying off Twitter for almost 2 full days. He tweeted, "Despite so many false statements and lies, total and complete vindication, and wow, Comey is a leaker." So one's a liar, the other's a leaker. And good morning to SMU political science professor Dr. Cal Jilson. Republicans are focused on the Comey leak, calling it improper. Critics of the president say what he did to Director Comey, what the president did, was obstruction of justice. There seems to be very little middle ground.
Yeah, in fact, I watched all 3 hours of the public testimony yesterday, and one of the things that struck me was that during the actual questioning, there wasn't that much distance between Democrats and Republicans. You did find Republicans trying to vindicate the president a little bit, get some of the things he has already said confirmed by Comey, and Democrats digging in to try to build this obstruction of justice case. But I really did think that the testimony itself was more bipartisan, both sides trying to get some information out than we have seen in recent years.
And interestingly, Director Comey, somebody with a sterling reputation of integrity, maybe some people questioning his judgment on some of the things he did leading up to the election, but nobody suggesting on either side that Comey's a liar.
Yeah, that's right. Comey is an old Washington hand. He's smart. He's articulate. He talks in details, very unlike President Trump, who talks in broad, sweeping terms. So the benefit that will come from Comey's testimony over the coming weeks and months and perhaps years as the investigation proceeds is all those details can be checked and verified or shown not to be true, whereas the president will be talking in broad, general terms about total vindication. Yesterday wasn't total vindication for him. It wasn't as bad a day as it might have been, but Comey speaking in those details and having those contemporaneous notes is going to drive this investigation as it goes forward.
A lot depends on your perception of things, on which colored glasses you're looking through. So here's James Comey. Let's listen on the president's suggestion that the Flynn-Russia investigation should just kind of quietly go away.
I took it as a direction. Right. I mean, this is the President of the United States with me alone saying, I hope this. I took it as this is what he wants me to do. Now, I didn't obey that, but that's the way I took it.
So important to note, Dr. Jilson, that the president cleared the room before conversations like that, even telling the Attorney General, James Comey's boss, get out of the room, I need to speak to him alone. What does that say?
Well, even Paul Ryan, who is the Speaker of the House and the senior Republican on Capitol Hill, said yesterday after the Comey testimony that Trump is new at his job, that he doesn't understand all the ways that all the norms that have been established by which Washington works, which would not allow the president to have a one-on-one with the FBI director without the Attorney General or his White House General Counsel being president. So Paul Ryan said, well, you know, Donald Trump just doesn't know all this stuff. He doesn't understand how Washington works. But this is going to get him in trouble because Comey does understand how Washington works, and he knew that that was an unusual situation, and he made those contemporaneous notes so that he would be able to recall and remember the details of what for him was a very unusual conversation.
The president put out his personal lawyer. Let's listen to what he said, talking about the very same words that James Comey was talking about, suggesting that the president was pressuring him. Here's the president's personal attorney.
The president never, in form or substance, directed or suggested that Mr. Comey stop investigating anyone, including the president never suggested that Mr. Comey, quote, let Flynn go, close quote.
So, happy Infrastructure Week, the week that the White House is planning for us to be talking about roads and bridges and highways and creating jobs. Does this pretty much, how long does this derail or sidetrack the president's congressional agenda?
Well, the president is at the Transportation Department of Washington today to try to talk about infrastructure, but the testimony and the Russia inquiry has overwhelmed everything else. If you look at the president's agenda in Congress, the attempt to repeal Obamacare, to move on and do tax cuts, to get an increase in the debt ceiling or a transportation bill, all of that seems to be stalled. There may be a little bit of movement in the Senate on Obamacare repeal and replace, but things have gone very, very slowly, and I think that will be the case going forward for the president's agenda as well.
Dr. Cal Jilson, thanks very much. Appreciate your insight on this Friday morning.
Anytime.